Looking back now, it feels surreal how much my life has turned upside down. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, everything seemed so simple, so predictable. We weren't a perfect family by any means, but I always thought we had each other's backs. My younger brother, Billy, was the troublemaker of the family, always stirring up chaos, but I never imagined that he'd be the one to blow my life apart. At the time, I was working at my dad's garage, keeping the family business running, and I was married to my high school sweetheart, Teresa. Life seemed good, or at least I thought it was. It all started to fall apart when Billy got even deeper into his mess with pills. My parents, always making excuses for him, kept enabling him in ways that hurt me. Against my better judgment, they pressured me into letting him stay at my place so he could get his act together. I didn't want him there, and I made that clear. But, in the end, I caved. Big mistake. What happened next was something I'll never forget, the ultimate betrayal from both my wife and my brother, the two people I trusted most. I still remember the day it all came crashing down. It was supposed to be a good day, a celebration. My promotion to shop foreman had just gone through, and we were throwing a barbecue in the backyard. The smell of grilled burgers and the sound of laughter filled the air as my friends and coworkers came by to celebrate. But I wasn't feeling the joy. To me, it felt more like a farewell party, though no one else knew it. As I stood on the porch, watching everyone have a good time, I knew something had to give. I was ready to walk away from it all. I stepped away from the crowd, my mind racing. I had no intention of just letting this slide. I had something planned, and it wasn't going to be pretty. I walked to my truck and grabbed what I needed, a little something for visual effect. I knew they'd ask me to give a speech, and when they did, I wanted to make sure it left a lasting impression. I tucked the item into my waistband, out of sight, and made my way back to the party. As I approached the crowd, I saw my boss, Tommy Peterson, heading toward me. He was one of those guys you couldn't help but respect. Tall, big smile, and even in his 50s, he had a presence that commanded attention. Beside him was his wife, Martha. Now, Martha wasn't really the problem, but she was definitely a big part of it. Always meddling, thinking she knew best. I should have cut ties with her months ago, but today, that was going to change. Martha had made it her mission to set me up with the perfect woman ever since I'd moved to town. What she didn't know, or refused to acknowledge, was that the woman she kept pushing on me was my ex-wife, Teresa. Yeah, that's right, my cheating ex-wife. The woman who had blown up my life, and yet here she was, sitting at a table, surrounded by Martha and her group of busybodies, all acting like they had found the ideal match for me. It was infuriating. They didn't know the full story behind our divorce. Teresa probably hadn't told them the real reason we split, how she had betrayed me with my own brother. No, she was good at leaving out the important details, playing the remorseful, heartbroken wife. She had everyone eating out of her hand, convinced that I was the one being unreasonable, that I was the one refusing to forgive her for some minor mistake. As the evening wore on, Tommy stood up to give a speech, formally offering me the position of shop foreman. I could feel the moment building, knowing what I was about to do. I stood up, cleared my throat, and said, "Tommy, I appreciate the offer, but I have to turn it down. In fact, I quit." You could hear a pin drop. The silence that followed my announcement was heavy. You could see the shock on everyone's face, but I wasn't done yet. I glanced at Tommy, feeling a little bad for springing this on him in front of everyone, but it had to be done. I continued, "I'm sorry to drop this on you like this, Tommy, and I get it if you don't want to give me a reference after this, but I'm leaving town tomorrow. No hard feelings, but it's time for me to move on." Before anyone else could speak, I locked eyes with Martha. "And as for you, Martha," I said coldly, "I told you I didn't want to date anyone, especially not my ex-wife. But clearly, what I want doesn't matter to you. You and your little group here have done enough. Either I speak now, or I leave for good. Your choice." The group was frozen in their seats. Teresa, sitting there with her head down, already crying. But I didn't care. This had been a long time coming. I wasn't about to stop now. "Let me tell you all a story," I began, watching as Teresa shook her head, silently begging me not to go on. 2 years ago, I left my hometown in Georgia. I had to walk away from a broken marriage and a family that turned their backs on me. I came here to start fresh, but my past caught up with me, with a little help. I glared at Martha before turning my gaze back to Teresa. I married Teresa right after high school. She was my everything. For 3 years, I thought we had the perfect life. I worked in my family's garage, and she worked at a beauty salon. We were building something together. But just like every story has its villain, my story had one too, and that villain was my younger brother, Billy. I paused, watching the uncomfortable looks on their faces. I didn't care. They needed to hear this. Billy has always been trouble, dropped out of school, got hooked on pills, and dragged my family through the mud with him. He was always their priority, never me. They bent over backward for him, and that included making excuses for him every time he messed up. When Billy got kicked out of his last place, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was when my family, and my wife, decided he should come live with us. My answer wasn't just no, it was hell no. But they wore me down, guilt-tripping me until I finally caved and let him move in. I turned my eyes back to Teresa, barely able to keep my voice steady. I thought I was doing the right thing, being the good brother. But how was I repaid for letting him stay? My wife slept with him. The gasps around the table didn't faze me. I was past caring what anyone thought. Teresa looked like she wanted to disappear, but I wasn't going to stop. A couple of months later, Teresa told me she was pregnant. I was thrilled, like any idiot would be. But it didn't take long for everything to come crashing down. I clenched my fists, feeling the rage bubbling up again, but I forced myself to stay calm. When the doctor told us there was a problem with the baby, a heart defect, I started to worry. The doctor asked if either of us had been using pills. Teresa denied it, of course, but then the doctor mentioned something else. He said that pill addiction in fathers could also cause defects. The memory of that moment, sitting in that sterile doctor's office, hit me like a punch in the gut all over again. I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't using, but I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach. So, I did what any man would do. I got a DNA test. I turned to the group, my voice hard as steel. And guess what? I wasn't the father. I was the uncle. The room was so quiet you could hear the wind outside. I glanced down at Teresa, who was quietly sobbing into her hands. My hands shook, and I had to take a deep breath to stop myself from losing it all over again. I kicked her out that day, I said flatly. I threw her stuff out of the house, grabbed my gun, and went looking for my brother. I wanted to make him pay for what he'd done. But my parents, always protecting their precious Billy, had already hidden him away in some rehab. And you know what's worse? They knew what he'd done. They all knew. For months, they sat around hoping I'd never find out. I could see the stunned expressions around the table, but I wasn't done yet. I filed for divorce the next day, and when my wife was served, that's when the excuses and apologies started pouring in. From her, from my parents, from everyone. But I wasn't having it. I refused to talk to her. I refused to forgive her. I kept my distance for weeks, ignoring every call, every message, every attempt to get me to sit down and talk. I couldn't stand the sight of her, the sound of her voice. It all made me sick. But my parents didn't let up. They brought in everyone they could think of to try to convince me to forgive her, including our church pastor. He sat me down one afternoon and gave me a long speech about the power of forgiveness. At that point, I'd had enough. I told him that if he wanted to preach about forgiveness, he could start with a sermon on Sunday about coveting your brother's wife. Then I'd give my own testimony before the whole congregation. Needless to say, I never heard from him again. But my parents, they didn't quit. They were relentless, telling me how I needed to be the bigger man, how Teresa was sorry, and how I should forgive her for the sake of the baby. They went on and on about how a real man wouldn't walk away from his wife and child, how they'd raised me better than this. It was like they didn't even hear me. One day, my dad said something that pushed me over the edge. He told me how disappointed he was in me for not forgiving Teresa and Billy. I snapped. I let them have it, told them exactly what I thought of them as parents. Things got ugly fast. They asked if I'd read the apology letter Billy had sent me, as if a few words on paper were supposed to make up for what he'd done. I told them I had, but that I'd used it as toilet paper. I made it clear that I didn't want to hear his name again, ever. When they didn't take me seriously, I made sure they got the message. That's when I went back to my truck. I reached behind me and pulled out what I'd been hiding, the gun. There were gasps, some people stood up, others just froze in place, but I wasn't worried. We were in Tommy and Martha's house, and I knew Martha had a strict no-weapons policy, so I was the only one carrying. In a low, threatening voice, I told them, "Mention that prick's name to me again, and I swear, you'll be burying your favorite son by the end of the week." I saw the color drain from their faces. They knew I wasn't bluffing. My parents believed me that day, and they haven't spoken to me since. Honestly, I'm fine with that. Too bad I can't say the same about Teresa. She never got the message, no matter how hard I tried to make her understand that it was over. But by then, I'd already made my decision to leave, and I was done with her for good. A few weeks later, I packed up and moved across the state line to Alabama. I left Teresa and the baby behind, only taking what I needed to start over. She tried to find me, of course. It took her 6 months, but she eventually did. I heard she'd had some kind of breakdown, ended up in the hospital after trying to take her own life. Part of me felt like I should care, but I didn't. The truth is, she brought it all on herself. When she finally tracked me down, she moved into the same trailer park I was living in. Even after I filed for a restraining order, she kept finding ways to come around. I tried to ignore her, tried to move on with my life, but she just wouldn't leave me alone. She still believed we were meant to be together, even after everything that had happened. She'd say we were soulmates, destined to be together forever. It used to sound sweet when we were younger, but now, it was just another reminder of how broken everything had become. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up and moved again, this time to Texas, where I thought I could finally get away from her and start fresh. But that didn't stop her. 3 months after I settled in, Teresa showed up again. She never told me how she found me, but it didn't matter. By then, my mind was made up. There was no going back. It didn't take long before Martha and her group of well-meaning but clueless friends got involved again. They saw how Teresa was always hanging around, looking sad and lost, and of course, they took it upon themselves to fix things. What they didn't know was that the more they tried to help, the worse it got. They thought they were doing the right thing by getting us face to face, forcing me to confront her. But all it did was stir up old wounds that were never going to heal. Martha and her friends didn't know the real story, though. They only heard Teresa's version, where she played the heartbroken wife who made a mistake and was just trying to make amends. She never told them about the betrayal with Billy, or how that mistake wasn't just a one-time thing, it was a fundamental destruction of everything I believed in. She never told them how she had destroyed our marriage with the one person who was supposed to have my back. And she sure as hell never mentioned how that baby wasn't mine. So there I was, surrounded by people who had no idea what they were doing, and Teresa, sitting there crying and trying to win me back. That was the moment when I realized that I couldn't escape my past, no matter how far I ran. When Tommy asked me to speak at the party, I knew it was my chance to finally set things straight, to tell my side of the story. I stood there and said, "I know this was supposed to be a celebration, but I've got something I need to get off my chest." All eyes were on me, and Teresa's tear-filled gaze was the hardest to ignore. But I didn't back down. I wasn't going to let her or anyone else control the narrative anymore. "I came here to start over," I began, "but no matter how hard I've tried, my past keeps catching up with me." I paused, letting the weight of what I was about to say settle in. A couple of years ago, I left my small hometown in Georgia because my marriage fell apart. My wife, Teresa, who some of you have probably met, betrayed me in the worst way possible. She didn't just cheat, she slept with my own brother, Billy. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. I could hear the murmurs, see the looks of disbelief on their faces. Teresa had her head in her hands, shaking, but I didn't care. She had brought this on herself. And to make it worse, I continued, she got pregnant. For a while, I thought the baby was mine, but after a DNA test, I found out the truth. I wasn't the father. Billy was. I could feel the tension in the room growing as everyone absorbed what I was saying. Some people glanced at Teresa, but most of them just stared at me, wide-eyed, not knowing what to say or do. But I wasn't done yet. That's why I left. That's why I moved here, trying to get away from all the lies and betrayal. But apparently, no matter where I go, people like Martha think they know better. Think they can fix something that's long since broken. Martha's face turned red with embarrassment as she realized how far out of line she'd been. "I'm sorry," she stammered, but I cut her off before she could say more. "It's too late for sorry," I said, my voice hard and unforgiving. "I told you all along to leave me alone, to stay out of my business. But you couldn't help yourselves, could you? You had to meddle, and now here we are. So congratulations. You've officially made my life here just as miserable as the one I left behind." I looked back at Teresa, who was now sobbing quietly. Her tears no longer moved me. "Teresa," I said, my voice low and cold, "go home to the kid. You're not bringing me back with you. You gave up that right the moment you betrayed me." Teresa's sobs filled the silence as I stared her down. "Please, Doug," she cried, "I can't do this without you. I need you." Her voice cracked, desperate, but it wasn't moving me. "I told you before," I said, "I'm not his father, and I never will be. You gave that up when you slept with Billy. So go find him, maybe he's in a rehab or a ditch somewhere, because I'm done." I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I didn't care. This was my moment, the one I'd been waiting for ever since I found out the truth. I pulled my gun from my waistband and slid it back into my belt, signaling that the confrontation was over. The crowd parted in front of me as I turned and walked toward my truck. I could hear murmured apologies, see a few sympathetic looks, but none of it mattered. As I reached the driveway, Teresa's voice broke through the night, her scream echoing off the house. "Doug, wait. Please don't leave me. I can't live without you." Her voice cracked, full of anguish, but I kept walking. "You'll live," I muttered under my breath as I climbed into the truck and slammed the door. I didn't look back as I pulled away, leaving her sobbing in the driveway. I'd like to say I felt sorry for her in that moment, but the truth is, I didn't. She had ripped my heart out, and all that was left now was the pain, the anger, and the cold certainty that I was finally free from the wreckage of our past. For a while after that, I tried to move on. I buried myself in work, hoping that fixing cars and getting my hands dirty would help me forget. But the truth is, I couldn't shake the memories of what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Teresa's face, or worse, Billy's smirk as I imagined him laughing behind my back. It wasn't long before I got the call that Teresa had tried to take her own life. This time, she'd nearly succeeded. Part of me wanted to feel something, sympathy, guilt, regret, but I didn't. If anything, I was relieved. Relieved that maybe, finally, she would stop chasing me, stop trying to put the pieces of our shattered lives back together. But instead, her death just reopened old wounds. I found myself thinking about Billy more and more, consumed by the need for closure. I'd left Georgia to escape the past, but the past had a way of catching up. And now, it was Billy's turn to face what he'd done. I sent 2 packages that day, one to my parents and one to Billy. The note I sent my parents was simple, telling them I knew they could take care of the baby once Billy was out of the picture. The other package, the one for Billy, was a little more personal. Inside was the smashed remains of my wedding rings, a single bullet, and a note that read, "Time to run." I knew Billy would panic. He'd go to our parents, crying to them for help, and that's exactly what he did. But I wasn't worried about them stopping me. By the time I made it back to Georgia, I was focused, driven by something darker than anger. Revenge. I spent days tracking him down, moving through all the familiar places we used to haunt together, the bars, the pool halls. Each place was soaked in memories, but none of them meant anything to me anymore. I finally found him sitting in a club on the outskirts of town, laughing with some friends like nothing had ever happened. That's when I heard it. One of his buddies, grinning like an idiot, said, "You really got him good, man. Seducing his wife just to stick it to him? I didn't think you had it in you." It felt like the floor dropped out from under me. I had always known Billy was reckless, but to hear that he had done it on purpose, out of jealousy to hurt me? My blood ran cold. I stormed out of the club, too angry to confront him right then. I needed a plan. I needed to make sure he paid for what he'd done. For days, I followed him, waiting for the right moment. And when he finally left the club alone one night, I made my move. I grabbed him from behind, dragging him to my car, and threw him in the trunk. I drove deep into the Texas desert, far away from anyone who could help him. When I finally stopped, I yanked him out and threw him to the ground. Billy was terrified, but I didn't care. I stood over him, cold and calm. "You took everything from me," I said, my voice steady. "Now it's your turn. You've got a choice: survive out here on your own or end it. Either way, this is where it ends." I left him there, alone in the desert with nothing but a bottle of water and a syringe filled with enough drugs to take the pain away, or end it all. As I drove off, watching his figure shrink in the rearview mirror, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: closure. A few days later, they found Billy's body. The authorities couldn't prove anything. They chalked it up to his drug history, said he'd probably run away and gotten lost in the desert. I was free, free from Billy, free from Teresa, free from the weight of my past. I moved back to my hometown a few months later and opened up my own garage. Working on cars gave me something to focus on, something to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't think too much about what I'd lost. The town hadn't changed much, but I had. I kept to myself, just trying to rebuild my life, one day at a time. That's when I met Sarah. She brought her beat-up old sedan to the garage one day, and we got to talking. She was different, strong, quiet, didn't pry into my past. We started spending more time together, and before I knew it, I found myself caring again. Not just about her, but about her son, Timmy, too. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe I had a future. It wasn't the one I had planned, and it would never replace the life I'd lost, but it was something new, something real. And for now, that was enough. Life isn't perfect, and the past still haunts me. But with Sarah and Timmy by my side, I'm learning to move forward, one day at a time. Thank you for visited my YouTube channel. Your support, likes, and comments truly inspire me to create even more engaging content. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. You're a part of this amazing community, and I'm thrilled to share my stories with you. See you in the next video on YouTube.